In the Darkness I See by Anon Y. Chapter 3. A Strange New Client. Part 1. He wore wet hair, the unkempt insignia of a teenager. He was 20. He was a rather attractive and slender young man with a deeply mournful brow. A small bruise crept up his face, subtle but unmistakable. Though his outrightly prepossessing charm was palpable, a furrow controlled his face. He looked downward most of the time. Somehow he did this in a superior way. There was no need for the darkest of indiscretion to uproar for that young man to have dismantled and dismissed affection. The loss that he bore and thin armor bared, in his heart, so distasteful, controlled his life. That was the only obvious thing about him. People were good for only one thing, hurting him. I had aided a multitude of clients before him that had been similar in angst, but it had always been insta-clearly no more than insecurities and shallow nihilism that had fueled their ardor for ignominy. He was different. His melancholy was unmatched. His face, though, was so familiar, like I had always known him. While my memory of our first meeting's inception remains foggy, I remember that a few weeks before our first interaction, there had been some pro bono work brought to me by my colleague, Randall Hall's wife. The newly made Hall, Victoria, was a desperate mother. She was by no means a trained professional, but she was like most older women, wise. She knew the fragility of a man's soul like no one else. She also understood, to her core, that once a man loses himself, there is no way back. Like my mother, she was privy to that reality through first-hand account. First-husband-hand account, to be specific. Like my father, that first husband had killed himself. Unlike my father, he hadn't taken the prolonged approach. Randall had described it, that thing of hers, to me much before Victoria and I had met, saying, he took his 12-gauge shotgun to the bathroom and gave Victoria that redecoration she had been wanting. Victoria had found her husband before her boy had come home, and so that, I reasoned, wasn't the origin of his deep and desolate despondency. Something else was eating her boy, that much she knew. His name was Thomas. He insisted that I used his full name, dictating it to be more appropriate. After an indiscriminate amount of time calling him by his lofty title, we entered real therapy and began using his shortened name. Immediately after I called him Tommy, he prodded back at me. He said impatiently, "I asked you not to call me that. What exactly are you getting at?" I responded after a pensive moment, saying, "I want to show you that we are not only associates. I am going to be guiding and healing from the inside out, client and aid. We must burst through all the frivolous barriers of your growth." After a brief and respectful pause, I reinstated my claim. "Open up," I said calmly. "Let me in." After another awkward silence, he stormed out. There were 12.5 minutes to spare. It had begun. Each time I had enlisted that direct and confrontational approach, my clients had all brought forth some version of furious rejection. That was how I knew that Thomas was coming back. Though few had expressed such a visceral rejection of reality, at some point they all had collected their personal grievances and compared them to their torturous existence's persistence, finding their way back to their senses and then to me. I knew immediately that his IQ rested well above average, 120 or higher, I supposed. It seemed feasible, given his concise and fast answers, allied with his use of quasi-insightful probing when faced with insecurity. In time, I would understand his IQ, especially his fluid reservoir, to be much higher. After my technical probes, placed in our brief introductions, had been analyzed, it became abundantly clear to me that a majority of his every second was a war, a battle bonanza of continued lifelong, thoughtful avoidance of trauma-induced strife and insecurity. It was not but seemingly a crafty path skillfully navigated by his internalized intellectual. Survival it was, as it is with most base, child-grown, underground caverns callable as adverse incompleteness. Personality disorders or ocean classifications being simple temperament-mediated manifestations of that said same unworthiness foe-proven by something. There was definitely something to Tommy. He practically breathed silent screaming. I knew too, much mostly for that reason, that the problem was of a strong sensual nature. I postulated 3 possible predictions. My first query: Tommy had experienced constant disapproval or disregard from his father, or from the plentiful stream of repeat new paternal influences so prestigiously paraded through his home by Victoria. And so, through the anguish and the pounding, care comparisons aplenty popping, a low satiating Oedipal fruit had grown high egregiously, ripened to voluptuosity. Too much now it had become for him to compartmentalize it all. My ankles swelled with empathetic stagnation for him. My second thought was that the widow's masculine parade had a devious and traitorous partaker who had taken Tommy's innocence, that dissatisfying secret no longer hideable. My third and final ideation was that the young man was too intelligent for his own good and had comorbid sociopathy and narcissistic personality disorder, perhaps disguised purposefully or guiltily by expression to me of some surely researched symptoms of avoidant personality disorder. I had a sneaky suspicion, by way obviousness and experience, that Tommy's truth was a partial mixture of all 3 of my postulates. After all, no rainy day ever coats the back of a spoon. It swamps and monsoons. I was entrapped within my curiosity and engulfed by my aidful magnanimity. Tommy, the masterful manipulator I would come to know, missed the next scheduled meeting, and the next. His absence troubled me. I tried calling Victoria 10 minutes before the 3rd session to ask where he had been. She didn't answer. 10 minutes later, he walked in. He handed over a note. He had inscribed the border with a sumptuous decoration as though it was a page from the Gutenberg Bible, rife with ornamentation. He walked out. I did not chase him. He had written, and I read, the following. Women are vessels for adoration as men are the stubborn chariots, with the muddy layers of hard decisions and huge mistakes flaking off in chunks onto the paving below. Men are never truly loved, not by any other than their mothers. Oh, those edible counterparts. A mother, in all her glory, cannot separate herself from her new collection of organs. Their small creature, so lovingly created, needs not to be kind, careful, or keen. The mother, no matter the circumstance, will offer up her life for that child with no indignation. And so we have arrived at love, this truest and most unbridled locution, love. Most men will not feel this again for any lengthy sentencing, at least. One lucky man in 100,000 may find themselves at the peak of their conquest for all and have the short-term potent sense of being lusted for and grovelled over. If such a man is ignorant enough to misinterpret these displays for anything other than self-serving prayers, then the man is stripped from his supreme locum and banished to fall to the realm of destitution. The admired matron allowed by his pre-downfallen heart, with his pride in her talons, squeezes the essence out from the mere mortal until he is squashed into humble solitude. This stain is worn by the man for as long as he draws breath, the pitiful anger residing within his belly for the remainder of his damned life. This is the fate for the lucky, favored, and few men. It sounded like the machinations of a broken young man. That eloquent prose, with all its doleful depravity, reminded me of my father. The anguish was so intense and misguided. I was magnetized to the prospect of deciphering the impetus in him to craft such a scornful judgment. Even with my mind begging me to walk away undamaged, my thirst for resolution engrossed me past reason. Striding towards the unknown, I began. I couldn't help myself, and so I officially and internally decided to accept him as my new client. This concludes Chapter 3, Part 1 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.